94 years ago this coming Sunday, February the 19th, the United States Supreme Court, in the case of Moore against Dempsey, granted a federal petition for habeas corpus for 6 of the 12 black men who were tried and convicted on charges of murder in the first degree in the death of a white man in connection with what has come to be known as the Elaine race massacre. We have heard those men's names called, but I think it would do us good to call their names again. We should not get tired of calling the names of people who have stood for something against all the odds. And so, if you would, please repeat after me their names. Alfred Banks Jr.
Alfred Banks Jr.
Ed Coleman.
Ed Coleman.
Joe Fox.
Joe Fox.
Albert Johns.
Albert Johns.
Paul Hall.
Paul Hall.
Ed Hicks.
Ed Hicks.
Frank Hicks.
Frank Hicks.
Joseph Knox.
Joseph Knox.
John Martin.
John Martin.
Frank Moore.
Frank Moore.
William Wardlaw.
William Wardlaw.
And Ed Ware.
Ed Ware.
Frank Moore, Ed and Frank Hicks, Joe Knox, Paul Hall, and Ed Coleman challenged the fairness of their convictions and death sentences in the Moore against Dempsey case. The other 6 of the 12 challenged their convictions in state court proceedings up to the Arkansas Supreme Court. They were known as the Ware defendants. Frank Moore, Ed and Frank Hicks, Joe Knox, Paul Hall, and Ed Coleman were known as the Moore defendants. The Moore defendants were represented by pretty strong lawyers, the Johnny Cochrans of their time. Moorfield Story was president of the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in Detroit, Michigan. And they're represented by Scipio Africanus Jones, a lawyer from Little Rock who's buried in Little Rock. There's a street named after Scipio Africanus Jones, and the black high school in North Little Rock was named after it. It was S.A. Jones High School. The Supreme Court, by a 6-2 margin, ruled that the Moore defendants were entitled to challenge the fairness of their convictions and death sentences in federal court after they had already been tried and convicted and had all of their state court appeals turned down and had an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court turned down. And it comes back into state court after having had their death sentences and a sentence of execution set. An execution date was set. They then started filing an injunction in state court. A Pulaski County Chancery judge issued an injunction. Even though he knew there wasn't jurisdiction for it, he issued the injunction. A white judge named Martineau issued the injunction to stop the execution, but the Arkansas Supreme Court overturned it. They then, Scipio Africanus Jones, then, days before they were scheduled to be executed, sued in federal court for habeas corpus. The federal district judge denied their habeas corpus petition, but notice what happened. Remember that white judge I told you about in Pulaski County Court? John Martineau, even though he had no jurisdiction, he mentioned in his ruling if they would file a petition in federal court, they may get some relief. And so, Scipio Africanus Jones went to federal court. They were turned down in federal court, and they appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. By a 6-2 ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court granted federal relief. Now, what the federal court did, what the Supreme Court did was basically said, the fairness of their convictions and their death sentences needs to be re-looked at because their trials were tainted by mob violence. They were tried, these 6 men, in less than an hour. Frank Hicks was the first one tried. His trial lasted less than an hour. The jury was out for the whole time of 8 minutes. Less time than I've been talking to you. Imagine having your life. Imagine having your life be decided in less than 8 minutes by a jury that does not include people who look like you. No person of color was allowed to serve on the jury. No person of color was allowed to serve on the grand jury. The witnesses against them included 2 black men who had been tortured in order to get testimony from them. This is the kind of evidence that the Supreme Court looked through and said, that doesn't look like a fair trial. That doesn't look like a fair trial. And to this day, the case of Moore versus Dempsey is a landmark case on the fairness of trials that stands for this situation. I think it's important we keep in mind that those 12 men were 12 of hundreds. They were 12 men, but there were hundreds of black people who were involved in the insurrection, the fight against oppression in Phillips County, because black people were not getting paid fairly for the crops they were farming. Let's just tell the truth. Let's just tell the truth. That's the context. And if we don't understand the context, if we don't understand the fact that what happened in Elaine was about worker justice, was about wage fairness, we won't be able to put the dots together. We won't be able to connect the dots. The Elaine race massacre and the Elaine 12 have a big connection with fair wages and fight for 15. The same people, the same kind of argument for fighting for the $15 minimum wage is what was going on in Elaine. And when you hear people say they are against raising the minimum wage, that's the same kind of mindset that was against paying black laborers in 1919. Please, young people, remember the dots. Otherwise, you will forget that whenever somebody says, we don't want to pay you a higher minimum wage, they're actually talking about spitting on the suffering of people who have suffered, bled, and died. I think we need to keep this in mind. And I would like to share with you this excerpt from the Encyclopedia of Arkansas concerning the Elaine race massacre. You can look up on the internet. It reads, the Elaine massacre was a riot that began on September 30th, 1919, after shots were fired between white men and black men outside of a Progressive Farmers and Household Union meeting in Hoopsburg, 3 miles north of Elaine. By the way, they were meeting at a church. Okay? Some of the best civil rights work gets started at church. If you don't like church, you miss out on a lot of civil rights stuff, okay? Okay? And if your church doesn't do civil rights stuff, you're not doing much church.
Amen.
I just said it again. If your church doesn't do civil rights stuff, you're not doing much church. If you can't get your civil rights on and your praise on, there's something wrong with you. Something funny about your religion. By the time order was restored on October 4th, countless African Americans, some range between 85 and more than 800, and 5 white men had been killed. We don't really know how many black people were killed, but the figures range between 85 and more than 800. In addition, 285 African Americans were arrested during the riots. Imagine 285 black folks getting arrested. That's more folks in this room. Okay? On October 31st, a month after the massacre, 122 black men were indicted by the Phillips County Grand Jury. The riots, September 30th, a month later, 100 black men were indicted. Trials began on November 3rd. October 31st, they were indicted, they were charged, they were tried 4 days later. I just told you the six more defendants were all tried for murder, and the jury was only out for 8 minutes to deliberate over Hicks's trial before finding him guilty. After Hicks's trial, the other 5 were tried together as accessories to murder and found guilty. The whole thing lasted less than an hour. I haven't found any evidence that a single white person was arrested, let alone charged or tried, for any of the black people whose lives were lost. And so I think of the Elaine race massacre when I think of Michael Brown Jr. I think of the Elaine race massacre when I think of Trayvon Martin. I think of the Elaine race massacre when I think of Sandra Bland. I think of the Elaine race massacre when I think of Amadou Diallo. I think of the Elaine race massacre when I think of Philandro Castile. I think of the Elaine race massacre every time I hear the words Black Lives Matter. And I think of the Elaine race massacre when I see news reports that law enforcement officers and immigration people are going around the country picking up immigrants and throwing them in jail and blocking them from the country. Because you understand what the Moore versus Dempsey holding was about due process. About due process. And the Supreme Court said you cannot take away people's rights without giving them basic fairness.
That's right, that's right.
Elaine stands as moral and ethical proof about the wicked effects of white supremacy, racism, and capitalism. It was about greed, okay? It was about racism. It was about white supremacy. It was about the idea that black folks didn't have a right to demand and be paid fair wages for their work. Elaine shows that white supremacists and their political lackeys will use the law. They'll use law enforcement officers. They'll use court proceedings. They'll use judges. They'll use anything they can as weapons against people they target for disfavor. Don't think that it just started happening, that folks started doing funny stuff with the law. Go back to Elaine. Elaine reminds us that people who are targeted for disfavor and who are trumped, that's not a pun on word, who are faced with trumped up charges, often count on support from good people. Okay, good people. Understand there were some good people who knew what was going on. And in fact, the one thing that got the federal habeas petition serious consideration was there were 2 white people who were around when the riots happened, and they gave affidavits about the torture. Don't ever underestimate the power of being good and brave.
All right.
Elaine reminds us that we who believe in justice must not be lulled into a sense of complacency. We can't think that we've gotten so far from where we used to be that we don't have to think about the way folks always are. Hello? Evil doesn't age. Evil does not age. You cannot age evil out. Hate does not age, and neither does good age. But you cannot allow the passage of time to let you feel comfortable. Think, well, we don't have to think about that. We don't have to worry about that anymore. No, yeah, you do. Remember Mr. Trump. Elaine reminds us that oppression is interconnected. 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 Say that word. Interconnected. 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 The racism over here against black folks is connected to the xenophobia over here against immigrant folks.
Right.
It's connected to the hate against Muslim folks.
Right.
It's connected to the hate against women folks.
Amen.
It's connected to the hate against LGBTQ folks. It's connected to the hate against young folks. It's interconnected. It's interconnected.
Amen.
This stuff is mixed up and fixed up and messed up. Elaine reminds us that people who believe in justice must not allow ourselves to get worn down by these realities. I know it's easy to say I get tired of thinking about racism. I get tired of hearing about violence. I get tired of hearing about folks being hateful. I get tired of trying to fight. But please understand, if you know about anything about struggle, people who must deal with struggle cannot afford to quit just because the struggle lasts a long time.
All right.
How many athletes we have in the house? Any athletes we have in the house? Okay, I see some athlete hands. You can't quit after the second quarter.
Amen.
That's right.
I mean, you can't quit after the second quarter. Just ask the Atlanta Falcons. I mean, you can't stop just because you get past halftime and the game is hard. You can't say it's too hard to keep fighting, it's too tough to keep dealing with it, they're too mean. You cannot quit. You must not quit. And we must not forget what we've been through. I know folks say, I get tired of folks bringing up that old stuff. Don't you get tired?
All right.
You understand? You're in real